That day, the couriers verified the entire sum entrusted to them for transportation. Upon finishing, the senior officer and the trainee got into the car, as it seemed they were the only ones working together that day. Moreover, the senior officer had a nagging feeling that something was amiss with those people who had recently been leaving for some obscure reasons. When asked whether he was being considered for a permanent position, the protagonist mentioned that he hadn't heard anything about it either. The day began like any other, but later, it turned out that everything was quite the opposite. The coffee didn't help his partner shake off the drowsiness. At one point, the partner complained that his eyelids had grown unexpectedly heavy. As it turned out, the truck following them wasn't just a coincidence either. It instantly rammed into the courier's vehicle. The last thing the young trainee saw before losing consciousness was the wounded driver. Later, the news reported that the crash was caused by the driver of the truck that had rammed into the couriers. Having provoked the collision, the driver, along with an accomplice, escaped with the money in another vehicle. When the boy finally opened his eyes, he saw neither heavenly clouds nor a hospital ward. Only a man addressing the director, explaining that the injured had finally woken up. The boy's name was Chon Henko, and no one here intended to treat him with any formality. Out of the corner of his eye, the protagonist spotted a nameplate on the desk, indicating it belonged to Director P. Sinon, though this information did him little good. In any case, the man noted that since the boy had awoken, he clearly had no idea what was happening. To begin with, it was important to remember what he had been doing before ending up here. And with that, there was no need to explain that the money he had been transporting had subsequently disappeared. In fact, he had had a bad feeling about the day, which is why he had sent his men to keep watch nearby, though they had been too far away to notice anything happening. Orders were given to inspect the scene before the police arrived, and only one person had survived. Strangely enough, only the passenger airbag had deployed. Therefore, there was just one thing the man wanted to verify. Could this young man, Chon Henko, be involved with the thieves? But in any case, if they couldn't find the person who escaped with the money, the responsibility would likely fall on him. It so happened that they had lost contact with his boss. The boss was supposed to know that a substantial sum had been in the car, and now the question arose. What were they to do next? The protagonist gave no answer, but his stomach spoke for him with an audible growl. Instead of anger, this elicited a loud laugh from the director. This could only mean that he was terribly hungry, so the first thing to do was to rise and sit on the sofa. In any case, they could discuss everything over a meal, and it was the leader, who set off to fetch it. Before long, one of his favorite dishes was brought out. It became clear that the boy was now so hungry that he could barely speak. So they offered him a strawberry shortcake with whipped cream, and it was simply delightful. The protagonist hesitated before accepting it, but the director insisted. Since Chon still didn't take it, the man decided to feed him personally. He had the distinct feeling that this dessert might be the last thing he would ever eat, but there was no point in refusing any longer. While the protagonist devoured the treat from another's hand, the man savored the scene with evident delight. At some point, Chon became so engrossed in the dish that he didn't even notice when it was gone. Such behavior, of course, outraged the deputy, but he wasn't given the chance to react properly. Without even realizing it, he managed to make an even bigger fool of himself. After this strange procedure ended, the deputy decided to wipe his superior. What truly intrigued him, however, was how this young man dared to behave in such a manner. But the director was only pleased, delighted that the protagonist had been so famished that he even licked his fingers. Finally, Chon couldn't take it anymore and asked to be killed right then and there. After all, he had never possessed so much money in his life, more than he could ever earn in a lifetime. Yet perhaps he could still be of some use if they sold his organs. In response, Sinon immediately began to justify himself, claiming that they weren't that kind of organization and shouldn't be regarded as villains. Perhaps Leader looked somewhat intimidating, but in truth, they were all good people. Nevertheless, the protagonist assured them he wouldn't even mind if they killed him. These words deeply unsettled the man, who couldn't understand why this young fellow so desperately wished for death. But in any case, he was allowed to go home and rest, so they could talk again tomorrow. After the meeting concluded, the leader asked whether the senior officer was certain about these actions. As it turned out, he needed time to properly think things over. He had just received some information about the boy, and if he didn't show up tomorrow, they would simply drag him in by force. According to the information, the boy had grown up in an orphanage and now carried a significant amount of debt, which meant his plea for death was likely genuine. But that's life. Unfortunate people tend to face misfortune over and over again. Therefore, it was necessary to send Chonsok to keep an eye on him, for in his current state, the boy might do something reckless. That night, the protagonist stood on a bridge, quietly gazing into the distance. The observer assigned to him reported this to the director. He also added that something was off. This place was infamous, known for people coming here to jump. At one point, Chonsok began to panic, thinking the boy might do the same. But as it turned out, he was merely going about his business. Suddenly, a guard appeared and informed him that the area was dangerous and suggested he hurry home. The next day, the debtor returned as agreed. This time, there were a few more people in the room than last time. But regardless, he was simply invited to come in and sit down with them. In the presence of all these people, the boy felt tense, making every step a struggle. However, the director noticed this immediately, and to ease the atmosphere, he dismissed his subordinates. Almost everyone complied at once, except for Chonsok, who remarked on his way out that something about the boy still troubled him. Once they were alone, the senior officer invited him to sit closer. Now, he confidently stated that he had learned more about the boy and could even understand why he so desperately wanted to die. But it seemed he lacked the courage to do it himself, and that was why he now begged so fervently for someone else to end his life. However, killing someone like him wouldn't benefit them in any way, so such thoughts should be cast aside. Today, it turned out, the man had once again brought him a snack. Though the protagonist insisted he had already eaten, Pei-sinan was sure that no dessert had been part of that meal. Yesterday, he had watched as Chan devoured his food with great pleasure. For a moment, it was as if he too could taste that very same flavor. So, there was a chance that if Chan ate with as much appetite as he had the day before, it might somehow help recover the money. The protagonist had no idea what this meant, but if it helped, there was no reason to refuse. But as it turned out, the director's true desire was to make the boy do something else. First, he really should eat this, and afterward, they could return to more serious matters. Chan couldn't understand why this man continued to feed him such delicious treats. Yet, the man genuinely enjoyed watching him savor the food. After finishing the dessert once again, Chan realized just how tasty it was, and he had the urge to lick off all the remaining cream. And this was precisely the reaction the director had anticipated. At one point, it became clear that some of the cream had dripped onto Pei-sinan's trousers. The boy's first thought was whether the director might get angry because of it. But within seconds, it dawned on him that these trousers could be quite expensive. Meanwhile, Pei-sinan was already preparing the next piece of the dish. The protagonist, however, concluded that he needed to clean the trousers with his tongue before it was too late. And so, to the director's surprise, he promptly set about doing just that. At that very moment, a curious onlooker quietly observed the scene, perhaps hearing them speak, though the words were impossible to make out from afar. His colleagues disapproved of these actions, urging him to stop. In the end, there was confidence that the director could handle everything on his own. However, at one point, the boy suddenly bent over, prompting Chonsok to urgently call over his senior colleagues. Soon, all three were quietly watching the strange scene unfold. Yet they all interpreted it in their own way, which left them slightly shocked. Ultimately, the leader was the first to leave, ordering the others to follow, as they had an emergency meeting to attend. Gathered around a table, they questioned whether what they had witnessed was real or merely an illusion. Just yesterday, the boy had begged for death, and even tried to leap into the river, but today, everything seemed to have shifted dramatically. They approached their leader for an explanation, believing he shouldn't have allowed such a thing to happen. However, the leader's reaction was entirely unexpected for his subordinates, for this meant that their Pei-sinan, in fact, was not impotent. Such a statement caught everyone off guard. As was known to all the employees, the man had failed to protect his lover. Since that day, the director had never been with anyone else. Was even surprised that the impact of that loss was still so profound. Even after so many years had passed, the man continued to feel it. And today's actions suggested that someone had managed to unlock the door to the director's heart. In that case, Chan Hen-ho might indeed be useful. He could genuinely help the director heal from his trauma, and this was a rare opportunity, given that they had only met 2 days ago. Therefore, once they were finished, it would be necessary to quietly apprehend the boy, for from this moment on, his body existed solely to belong to the director. After finishing the sweets, the protagonist realized the grave mistake he had made. However, he had no idea what consequences this error would bring. Chan was forcibly taken to the rest of the director's subordinates, who had been waiting for him. He was also forced to dip his fingers in ink and leave prints on some document. It turned out to be a contract obligating him to entertain the director. He would now have to fulfill any orders or desires. Since he had no money to repay his debts, The only option left was to use his body for that purpose. The next day, the protagonist set off for his new job. In truth, he still felt incredibly awkward about the situation from the previous day. After all, he had only wanted to clean the cream off someone else's trousers but ended up licking it off far too thoroughly. This was exactly what he explained to the director when the latter suddenly grew very curious about what had happened. For some reason, the director seemed quite worried at that moment. Later, his subordinates had grabbed him and forced him to sign some kind of contract. He genuinely didn't know how to act in such a situation, as he had never found himself in a mess like this before. Thinking about it now, Chan had no idea how he was supposed to meet the director's needs. Perhaps it was simply about eating cakes, as if that alone would suffice. Or maybe it was about licking the cream off the man's fingers. He had thought the director would be furious, but instead it had been quite the opposite. And yet those people still spoke to him in a very strange way. He couldn't get the events of the previous day out of his head. On his way home, the boy felt pain in his arm, which meant he'd need to apply some ointment. After all, the job had turned out to be more exhausting than he'd expected. Upon returning to his apartment, he ran into his neighbor, Jae-soo, who had somehow woken up earlier than usual. Apparently, Jae-soo had been working on some task through the night. In any case, the protagonist wasn't too concerned, as he was utterly drained. Suddenly, he felt the urge to ask his neighbor something. Specifically, whether, if he joined a company or some sort of organization, he should always obey the orders of the general director. Or should he listen to the department heads and the director's assistants instead? This question made the neighbor pause and think. In his response, he suggested that the protagonist would be doing tasks with other people, not the bosses. In any case, the director would give orders and the people would carry them out. So whatever those higher up told him to do, he should follow and complete the assignments. Eventually, his friend finished his task and prepared to leave. He also worried about Chan possibly being hungry, so he bought him a banana. But Chan found himself unable to simply take it. While working, he had accidentally strained his arm. His friend had to peel the banana for him, after which the protagonist eagerly began eating the fruit. However, the way he ate it was rather strange, stirring certain feelings within Jae-soo. Still, Jae-soo didn't explain anything and instead hurried out. In this instance, the protagonist came to the conclusion that perhaps the director had felt just as awkward while Chan had been licking the cream off his trousers. It seemed that the director might have actually desired it, which is why his subordinates had forced him to sign the contract. The next day, Pei Sinan made an effort to appear as neat and polished as possible. He was genuinely pleased with the results of his efforts. That morning, he was also greeted by who had brought him various groceries. This behavior somewhat surprised him, but it turned out the assistant wanted to make a healthy juice. After all, if you eat greens and fruits every day, you'll soon become much healthier. However, the director didn't want delivering food to him, as if he were some kind of courier. The man himself saw no issue with it. In any case, he just wanted to make the juice now. After all, he genuinely enjoyed delivering food to Pei Sinan. It was better than having him go shopping. Besides, he always said he was happy to help from the bottom of his heart. In any case, he'd continue helping until the day he died. Therefore, it caused him no inconvenience to make the juice every morning. And in general, if the director drank it, he'd become healthier, which in turn would bring great joy to his subordinates. If he drank it, all matters would go more smoothly. Suddenly, also remembered that boy they had recently encountered. They had done something behind his back, but it was decided that they should tell him directly to avoid any issues later. So, he believed he was doing everything right by providing what Pei Sinan needed at the moment. The director didn't fully understand what was referring to, but in any case, he suggested they discuss it in his office. Left alone, the man began to think about Chan Hen-ho. As each time he saw the young man, he felt strangely flustered, especially during that moment when the cream was licked off his trousers. At that moment, it had been impossible to remain calm, no matter how hard he tried. A little later, Pei Sinan called his uncle to inform him that the person had been found and was currently being tracked down. It was most likely somewhere in China, but it would take some time to find them, as it seemed they weren't dealing with just one group. The call had to be cut short due to the unusually loud commotion coming from behind the door. Finally, the man asked directly what was going on out there. The first to respond was Chan, who politely greeted him. However, the greeting was left incomplete. So the boy declared that he had come because he missed him. Supported the boy, remarking that it was very sweet, and overall, quite amusing. Since this wasn't the end, the protagonist felt the need to remind them of that. So he announced that he had seen a beautiful cake and decided to buy it. It was a fig cake, which he had waited in line for since early morning. Immediately after that, All the subordinates decided they would be unnecessary there and left the room. On their way out, they wished him a good time. Left alone, Pei Sinan immediately pointed out that the boy was a terrible liar, and everything he said was clearly untrue. He was obviously forced to say it all. So, he wanted to know if this had been Am's idea. The protagonist, of course, began to deny everything. But the director misinterpreted this and assumed his companion was simply afraid of him. After all, in the past, he had indeed been a frightening person. And judging by appearances alone, Leader Am looked even more intimidating. Not to mention his other subordinates weren't exactly the friendliest either. But then Chan remarked that, in fact, the director was quite attractive. And this was the truth. Eventually, the man conceded that these words had their effect, though he still believed that Am had coached him, as it seemed like they were plotting something behind his back. If that wasn't the case, then Chan needed to explain why he was flirting with him like this. What exactly was he trying to achieve? As it turned out, all the protagonist wanted at that moment was to be fed again today. But this time, he intended to be careful not to stain the trousers. However, the issue wasn't really about the trousers getting dirty. Seeing that innocent look in his eyes, Pei Sinan realized he couldn't just express what he truly felt about the situation. So, he asked him to forget those words and agreed to share another dessert. While the protagonist chewed, the man inquired how it tasted, as he remembered that this particular cake had a rather refined flavor. In any case, one question remained for him. What would happen next after the dessert was finished? Perhaps it was time for him to take the initiative. At one point, Chan froze, clearly wanting to discuss what would come after. Instead, he was shown that there was still some cream left on his face. The director was ready to handle it himself, so he asked Chan to come closer. The boy assumed that this was the moment when he could finally satisfy those very needs. To Pei Sinan's surprise, the guest didn't stop when asked not to come so close and kept approaching until they were almost face to face, close enough for a kiss. But the director didn't take the bait, managing to pull back in time, and asked directly what he was planning. That's when Chan explained that he thought he had been instructed to come near his lips. Once again, he had misunderstood. What the gesture had meant was simply that there was cream on his lower lip. Realizing he had messed up yet again, the boy quickly began apologizing. Despite it all, the man finally understood the real reason why the debtor was behaving this way. He knew well that when someone is in debt and unable to repay it, they have little choice but to offer themselves in place of the money. Pei Sinan actually felt nothing but disgust for such people. Yet he had to acknowledge the effort. It wasn't easy to play such innocent charm, so he decided to allow it, but only for him. And if Chan was being this obedient, it meant Pei Sinan had been right all along. But if he was going to seduce him, he should at least learn how to do it properly. Eventually, they found themselves dangerously close to one another again. Understanding what needed to be done, the boy made the first move. But at the last moment, for some reason, he pulled back. So the man had to ask directly what that was all about, as all the boy had done was lightly brush his lips. No one could be seduced like that, and another chance like this might not come again. He needed to act with more determination. In that instant, the director began to reflect on his current emotions. Meanwhile, the subordinates were busy with their own tasks. At one point, Chansak suddenly wondered aloud how the director could eat sweets every day without getting sick of them. Any normal person would have had enough by now, and he didn't even drink tea with the cakes. This question gave his companion pause for serious thought. The reason for such behavior was a rather tragic story. In truth, the director had never really liked sweets, but he used to love sharing cakes with his beloved. However, after that day, he could no longer enjoy the taste of desserts. The younger one decided to inquire further, as typically, people ate sweets precisely for the pleasure of the taste. But Pei Sinan hadn't been able to taste anything sweet since that day, likely a result of the trauma. It wasn't a secret, just something the director chose not to bring up unnecessarily. And though the man would describe the flavors when he ate, it was perhaps just a reflection of his old memories. But right now, Director Pei Sinan couldn't comprehend what was happening. Somehow, at this moment, he was able to taste sweetness again. Those clumsy kisses actually felt incredibly sweet. The protagonist, unsure whether his action had been pleasing or not, reassured him, saying he could do anything if it made the director happy. In that case, Pei Sinan intended to test something. He needed to be sure it wasn't just his imagination. Soon, it became clear that it was no mistake. He truly was feeling that intoxicating sweetness. And this person, it seemed, had some kind of talent for driving the man wild. So there was no longer any reason to hold back. It hadn't even been 10 minutes before Pei Sinan caught himself thinking that he shouldn't have let his emotions get the better of him. So he immediately assured Chan that he was ready to pay for dry cleaning. In fact, it might be better to just throw the clothes away altogether. He'd give him money for a new outfit. Better yet, they should take everything off right now. They couldn't leave the room looking like this. People might get the wrong idea. After walking a bit through the building, they stumbled upon a well-decorated room. It was located just above the office, and the atmosphere here was entirely different. The first issue the host of the room faced was what to give his guest to change into. He had hoped there'd be at least a t-shirt lying around, but nothing like that could be found. So they had to make do with what was available. For now, the clothes had to come off. This statement left the protagonist feeling quite flustered. But as it turned out, this was simply necessary for changing into clean clothes and nothing more. As planned, the boy began undressing to put on something fresh. Watching him, the director couldn't resist asking if he was eating properly, as he seemed awfully thin for a boy his age. These words only added to the protagonist's embarrassment, causing him to turn away. Thus, Chan put on the borrowed shirt, which was perhaps a bit too large for him, but there wasn't anything better available. Noticing the oversized collar, the man decided to adjust it. In that moment, a sudden curiosity struck him. What had caused that sweet taste since there didn't seem to be any scent of it on Chan? Nothing made sense, yet the deed had been done. In response, the protagonist politely assured him that he'd wash and return the clothes later. Though he had been told to seduce the director somehow, it was the elder who lost control first. But that no longer mattered. The most important thing was that now Pei-sinon could taste sweetness again. Later that day, the director invited all his subordinates into his office. No one knew the reason for the gathering, but it felt as though today was some kind of celebration. Confirmed that today was indeed a special occasion for the director. However, it was decided that they would discuss it later. First, they needed to try the cake. Pei-sinon wanted to be the one to blow out the candles. For Chansak, the cake was almost too sweet as he wasn't fond of such things. But it seemed the others rather enjoyed it. Now, all that remained was to hear the director's opinion. Yet, the man couldn't confirm the shared sentiment about the dessert, as he still couldn't taste a thing. After some time, the protagonist finally made it back home. It was now crystal clear to him that in order to repay such a massive sum, he would have to keep doing these kinds of things. Yet, despite everything, the scent lingering on that shirt was oddly comforting. But that wasn't what he should be worrying about. What mattered now was getting the shirt off and throwing it into the laundry. The next day, he had to head to his classes. However, it was much harder than usual due to his sprained wrist, and now he wasn't sure if he'd be able to find a job where he didn't need to use his hands. Suddenly, a classmate named Jisok approached him, curious if Chan was free that day. A message had likely already gone out in their group chat about the monthly student gathering. Jisok was compiling a list of attendees since he was the class representative. They were all students, after all, and understood one another. But Chan couldn't give an affirmative answer, as it was time for him to go to work. He promised to try and attend the next gathering. Over time, Jisok had noticed that Chan disappeared right after classes, so he wanted to know what kind of job was keeping him so busy. After all, tutoring paid well, and Jisok even offered to recommend him to some acquaintances. Thinking it over, Chan realized that tutoring didn't require much physical effort, and if he managed his time well, it could work out. So he agreed to give it a shot. After exchanging numbers, they promised to call soon to discuss the details. Suddenly, Chan remarked that perhaps because Jisok was the class representative, he seemed incredible, taking care of even the loners. He hoped that with more time on his hands, he could start attending gatherings more frequently. In any case, he had to run now. Later that day, Chan arrived at the director's office, and while Pei-sinon enjoyed the sweets he had bought, Chan played the role of a cleaner. However, the tasks assigned to him were finished rather quickly. Still, Pei-sinon always managed to find something else to keep him busy. Chan, of course, followed every command, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the director was in a bad mood today, and he just hoped it wasn't his fault. Not long ago, the man had mentioned a nearby cafe, asking him to go there and buy all the sweetest things they had. There, they introduced him to their new item, handmade, and said it was incredibly sweet. Though Chan thought he had picked exactly what was needed, it somehow didn't seem quite right. Nonetheless, he needed to focus on cleaning for now. Eventually, he dusted every corner he could find and began searching for more tasks. Pei-sinon, in truth, was surprised at how thoroughly the boy handled every chore he could think of. Unable to come up with anything else, he finally told Chan to just sit and wait until he was needed again. Time passed, but the director didn't ask him to do anything else. With no tasks or distractions, the worker slowly began to drift off to sleep. Before long, Pei-sinon noticed. Chan was sleeping so deeply that he even started drooling. As Pei-sinon checked how deeply he was asleep, Chan suddenly awoke, seeing a finger touching his lips. The boy immediately apologized, assuring him it had happened by accident. However, in response, the director remarked that it seemed his employee had decided to turn the office into his personal bedroom. Seeing this sudden closeness, Chan once again insisted it wasn't intentional. But it turned out that the director's goal wasn't just to scold him. In that moment, Pei-sinon could once again taste that strange, elusive sweetness, something he couldn't find anywhere else. This made him curious to figure out just what this boy really was. After yet another kiss, his partner didn't even notice how his hand accidentally gripped Chan's shirt, causing it to tear rapidly. Realizing what had happened, the protagonist was filled with a brief moment of fear. However, no one was angry with him. If anything, they were surprised that despite his thin appearance, the boy possessed such strength. In any case, the question remained, what were they going to do next? Chan knew that he had to do everything, absolutely everything that was asked of him. He returned home later that night. As if nothing had happened, he brushed his teeth as usual before going to bed. By that time, his roommate was already peacefully asleep, unlikely to be disturbed by anything. The protagonist was still so nervous from the day's events that his body remained tense even now. But despite it all, he had nothing to be ashamed of. That look, when the director gazed down at him, combined with the roughness of his touch. It was such a strange yet undeniably thrilling feeling that had washed over him in that moment. Perhaps it was truly odd to think that he had actually enjoyed the situation. Before bed, he decided to distract himself with his phone, and to his surprise, there was a message from Jisok asking what he was up to. It was so unexpected that the phone nearly slipped from his hands. After a brief exchange, it became clear that his classmate had found him a job and suggested meeting over the weekend to discuss the details. It all sounded great, but Chan was worried about a potential summons from the director that same weekend. His friend understood the situation, so they agreed to catch up on Monday when they were both back at the university. In any case, for now, all he needed to do was go to sleep and try to forget everything that had happened today. Meanwhile, the other student, Jisok, wasn't asleep either, still pondering just how busy Chan seemed to be. And yet, he promised himself that if Chan landed the tutoring job, he'd do something more. He'd do whatever was asked of him, no matter what it was. Suddenly, the protagonist smelled an overwhelmingly sweet fragrance. As it turned out, it came from a massive cake that had mysteriously appeared before him. His first thought was that Pei-sinon would definitely be pleased if he brought him something this magnificent. So he decided to climb to the very top of the cake. But the task proved far more difficult than expected. It was almost as if the cake itself didn't want him to succeed and started resisting. What looked like an innocent drop of cream turned out to be so large that it completely drenched him. In the end, he began to panic, finding himself trapped in a sea of cream. Suddenly, someone appeared, eager to solve the problem. The man, without hesitation, remarked that Chan had intended to bring him the cake, but instead had turned into dessert himself. So all that was left for him to do was to take as much as he could eat. The director savored the taste, and Chan was only too happy to hear it. But as it turned out, those gentle touches, which had seemed so sweet and tender, were coming from his roommate. When asked what was going on, Jisoo explained that Chan had been making strange noises in his sleep and had even curled up in an odd position, like a dog. The protagonist explained his behavior as the result of a nightmare that had made him act that way. His roommate accepted the explanation, though he found it hard to believe something like that. Once the situation calmed down, Chan suddenly realized what that dream had been about. Later that day, he had to apologize to Leader for being late. The man wanted to know if Chan was fulfilling his duties and doing everything the director asked of him. Uncertainly, the young man assumed that he was doing everything correctly. But such a hesitant answer didn't convince the man, who reminded him that they didn't send him there just to eat cake. If Pei-sinon wasn't interested in him, he wouldn't have gotten off so easily. So this time, he needed to put in more effort. This time, when Chan arrived, he found the director asleep. He decided it would be a bad idea to disturb his sleep, so he quietly sat beside him. Suddenly, he became curious about which sweets the director would be eating that day. However, the package in front of him looked quite different from what he had seen before, and it turned out to contain a button that made a mysterious object move. The strange sounds eventually woke the sleeping director, who simply noted that Chan should have woken him up as soon as he arrived. But first, Pei-sinon wanted to hear about the thing Chan was holding in his hands. In the end, the director decided to test his employee. This all happened because of the contents of the box that the leader had given, and also because the boy had lied, claiming the box was his. This answer, of course, surprised Pisinon, as he hadn't expected something like that from him. When asked if he even knew how to use it, Chan hastily confirmed that he did. But the man didn't believe him and asked him to stop lying and tell the truth about how the item had ended up in his possession. Despite everything, the protagonist insisted that he had bought it himself for today's meeting. In that case, Pisinon intended to see how the boy would prove his words in action.